No unauthorized commercial vehicles. HOA Regulation 7, Section 12, Paragraph B.
That's what she said. To a school bus driver, during a mandatory evacuation, 43 kids with backpacks on, engines running, trying to get out of a storm, blocked at the gate by a woman with a clipboard and a golf cart, diesel smoke curling into a sky the color of a bad bruise. She didn't flinch, didn't look at the kids, just tapped her clipboard and waited for the driver to back down. Not a police order, not a judge. A homeowners association rule. My daughter was one of those 43 kids. I was standing 20 yards away. I didn't yell. I'd spent 18 months preparing for this moment. Have you met your Marlene yet? Drop her below. She deserves to be named. Let me back up about 18 months, because this story starts the way most disasters do. Quietly, with paperwork. My name is Dex Calloway. I'm a retired Army Corps of Engineers contractor, 54 years old, and I moved my family to Pelican Cove Estates in coastal Georgia because my wife, Renata, grew up 40 miles from there and wanted her mother close after the stroke. We're not fancy people. We have a 2-story house with a wraparound porch, a dog named Sergeant who sheds enough hair to build a second dog, and a daughter, Lily, who was 9 years old and in 3rd grade at Coastal Pines Elementary, right at the edge of our development. Pelican Cove is one of those planned communities that looks like a Thomas Kinkade painting from the outside and feels like a Soviet-era apartment block from the inside, if the commissars wore visors and drove golf carts. Every blade of grass is regulated, every fence color pre-approved. Every mailbox must be regulation-compliant Brunswick pewter, not, God forbid, midnight charcoal. The HOA board met on the 2nd Tuesday of every month in the clubhouse, which smelled perpetually of carpet cleaner and quiet resentment. And at the center of it all sat Marlene Duckett. Marlene was 61, a retired regional sales manager for a medical supply company, and she had been the HOA president for 6 consecutive years, which, if you've spent any time in HOA culture, is the governance equivalent of being a mid-level warlord. She wore her authority the way some people wear cologne, heavily, and apparently unaware that everyone around her was suffering for it. The first time she crossed me, I told myself it was nothing. She sent a formal violation notice, printed on HOA letterhead, mind you, because I had placed 2 orange traffic cones at the foot of my driveway while I was resurfacing it. The cones, she wrote, created an aesthetically disruptive visual corridor inconsistent with Pelican Cove aesthetic standards, Article 4. She fined me $40. I paid it. Renata said, "Don't start, we just got here." Fine. The second time I was less patient. Coastal Pines Elementary shares a driveway access with the community's east entrance, an arrangement that had existed for 15 years before we moved in, formalized in a shared-use easement recorded at the county courthouse in 2008. Every school morning, the bus pulled in, kids walked up, bus left. Simple, clean, never an issue. Until Marlene decided the easement was being abused. She had the HOA attorney, a nervous little man named Greer, who looked like he'd been folded into his suit, send the school district a letter claiming the easement was limited to 7-passenger vehicles or fewer, and that commercial transport vehicles, including school buses, constituted a violation. The school district, bless their underfunded hearts, didn't have the bandwidth to fight it. They rerouted. Now the kids, 43 of them from Pelican Cove, including Lily, had to walk 6/10 of a mile to the county road stop, rain or shine, past a drainage ditch with no sidewalk. My daughter came home one Tuesday in November with soaked sneakers and mud up to her knees, holding her backpack over her head. She didn't cry. She's tougher than I deserve. But she looked at me with those big brown eyes and said, "Dad, why can't the bus just come here like before?" I had no good answer, and I decided that was the last day I wouldn't have one. I knocked on Marlene Duckett's door that evening. She opened it 4 inches, chain on, and told me, politely but with the frost of a woman who has practiced this exact tone, that I could submit a formal grievance at the next board meeting, which was 3 weeks away, and that she'd be happy to add it to the agenda. The chain stayed on, so did my resolve. I showed up to that board meeting with a manila folder, a printed copy of the 2008 easement agreement, and the specific citation from Georgia Code Section 44-9-1 governing shared use easements. I'd spent 2 evenings at the kitchen table with my reading glasses and a yellow highlighter, the way I used to prep technical specs for Army contracts. Sergeant curled at my feet, occasionally sighing at my dedication. The clubhouse was half full, maybe 20 neighbors, most of them there out of habit rather than passion. The folding chairs had that particular squeak that makes every shift feel like a public announcement. The coffee was stale in the way that institutional coffee always is, leaving a thin film on the back of your teeth. Marlene sat at the center of the board table in a blazer the color of old money, flanked by 2 board members, Theo Haynes, a retired dentist who agreed with everything she said, and Peg Whitfield, a woman who had the look of someone who had been meaning to quit this board for 3 years and just hadn't gotten around to it. I waited my turn. I was polite. I presented my case, passed out copies of the easement, and explained that the restriction Marlene's attorney had cited, the 7-passenger vehicle limit, did not appear anywhere in the original recorded document. I had checked it twice. I'd even called the county clerk's office to confirm. Marlene listened with the expression of someone watching a child explain why the sky is actually green. When I finished, she smiled. "Mr. Calloway," she said, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who has been condescending for decades. "The board has a legal obligation to interpret the easement language in a manner consistent with community safety and aesthetic standards. Our attorney has provided his professional opinion, and the board stands by it." "Your attorney's opinion isn't a legal ruling," I said. "It's sufficient for our purposes." "Does that mean you're refusing to restore bus access?" "I mean that this issue has been reviewed, and the board's position is unchanged." She glanced at her agenda sheet. "Moving on. Item 6, the request for additional exterior lighting at the tennis court." "I'm not done." The room went quiet. Peg Whitfield looked at her hands. "Mr. Calloway," Marlene said, still smiling, "you've had your time. Additional comments can be submitted in writing within 14 days per Robert's rules, as adapted in our— "Then I'll see you in county court," I said, and sat down. She moved on to the tennis court lighting. Theo nodded about lumens. I sat there with my folder, jaw tight, smelling the carpet cleaner and the old coffee, and I thought, okay, if she wants it formal, we'll go formal. I called a real estate attorney the next morning. Her name was Vivian Okafor, 40 years old, 12 years of property law, the kind of lawyer who answers her own phone and doesn't waste words. I explained the easement situation. She pulled the recorded document in about 45 minutes and called me back. "She's wrong," Vivian said. "The 7-passenger limitation your HOA is citing doesn't exist in the document. The easement is a general ingress-egress easement for school-related traffic, recorded without vehicle class restrictions. I can file an injunction." Takeaway. A HOA attorney's professional opinion is not a court order. Always pull the actual recorded document from your county clerk's office before accepting any HOA legal interpretation as fact. We filed the injunction request on a Thursday. By the following Tuesday, the week before the board meeting where Marlene planned to formally codify her vehicle restriction into the HOA's governing documents, the County Superior Court issued a temporary restraining order prohibiting the HOA from interfering with school bus access to the shared easement. Vivian emailed me a copy at 7:14 p.m. I was standing at the kitchen counter eating leftover chili. I set down my spoon, read it twice. Then I walked into the living room, where Renata was watching a home renovation show, and I said, "The TRO came through." She looked up. "Did you win?" "First round." She nodded and went back to her show. This is why I married her. The next morning, a school bus pulled into Pelican Cove for the first time in 4 months. Lily was standing at the end of our driveway in dry shoes. The bus driver, a big guy named Earl with forearms like bridge cables, gave me a thumbs up through the windshield. I figured that was the end of it. I was wrong in the way that people are wrong when they forget what kind of animal they're dealing with. Marlene's response to the TRO was not to comply quietly and move on like a reasonable person. Her response was to escalate, methodically, persistently, and with the particular creativity that petty power develops when it's been denied something it considers its birthright. First, she had the HOA install a new entry gate at the east entrance. Not an old gate, a new gate. $14,000 from the Community Reserve Fund, approved in an emergency board session held with 24 hours notice at 7 a.m. on a Wednesday, which she knew most working residents couldn't attend. The gate had a keypad, a sensor arm, and, crucially, a posted weight limit of 8,000 pounds. A loaded school bus weighs approximately 26,000 pounds. The TRO covered the easement's use. It did not, Marlene's attorney argued, prohibit the HOA from making structural improvements to common property, including a gate that happened to have a weight limit. Vivian was annoyed in the clinical way that good lawyers get annoyed. Precisely, and with documentation. She's gatekeeping with infrastructure, Vivian told me on the phone. It's creative, I'll give her that. Can we stop it? We can go back to court, but that takes time. In the short term, the school district's buses are blocked again. Lily went back to walking. I drove her myself, parking on the county road and watching her cross until I could see Earl's bus from where I stood. And I waited every afternoon the same way. But I was also watching other things. I started attending every HOA meeting. Every single one. I sat in the front row with a legal pad, took handwritten notes, date, time, speaker, exact wording, and submitted public records requests for every board communication and expenditure going back 36 months. This is your right in most states. HOA financial records and meeting minutes are member-accessible documents. Takeaway. In Georgia, under the Georgia Property Owners Association Act, OCGA, Section 44-3-226, HOA members have the right to inspect financial records, meeting minutes, and governing documents upon written request, and the HOA must respond within 30 days. What I found in those records was interesting. The $14,000 gate had been approved from the Community Reserve Fund, but there were two problems. First, the reserve fund had a minimum balance requirement written into the HOA's own bylaws, $50,000, and after the gate expenditure, the balance was $47,200. They had violated their own rules. Second, the vendor who installed the gate was Duckett & Sons Exterior Solutions, a company registered in Chatham County. Marlene's nephew ran it. I printed this on paper and put it in a folder. I labeled the folder for later. I was learning to be patient. Meanwhile, Marlene had a new project. She began organizing what she called community safety walks, informal groups of residents who, she said, were monitoring for code compliance and security concerns. In practice, it was 3 people with clipboards who walked the neighborhood, documenting violations. Houses with decorations Marlene didn't like, cars parked outside painted lines, any sign of anything not in the manual. My house received 4 notices in 6 weeks. One for a wind chime Renata had hung on the porch. Non-compliant decorative accessory per Article 9. One for a small vegetable planter box Lily had built for a school project. Unapproved structure, rear yard setback violation. One for Sergeant's dog bowl left on the front step. Unsanctioned personal property in common visual corridor. And one, my personal favorite, for a small American flag I'd placed in the flower bed to mark Veterans Day, which was, per Marlene, not pre-approved for placement in front yard landscaping zones. An American flag, on Veterans Day. I am a veteran. I didn't rage. I took a breath. I smelled the salt air coming in from the coast. We were in October now, the Georgia coast carrying that thick marine smell, the kind that coats the back of your throat. And I thought about patience. I appealed each violation formally, in writing, citing specific Georgia HOA law and relevant case precedent Vivian had provided me. I won 4 for 4. The violations were dismissed, but it cost me time, attention, and a measurable amount of peace of mind. What Marlene understood, what she had always understood, was that bureaucratic warfare is a war of attrition. She had 6 years of experience and institutional infrastructure. She was betting I'd get tired. She'd never met anyone who spent 22 years calibrating explosive charges to precise tolerances in hostile environments. I don't get tired, I get methodical. By December, I had something Marlene did not, a coalition. It hadn't happened all at once. It grew the way resistance usually does, quietly, in kitchens and driveways, in the drop-off line at Coastal Pines, in text threads that started with, "Did you get one of those violation notices too?" and escalated from there. There was Braddock Finley, a 47-year-old plumber who'd been fighting the HOA for 2 years over a storage shed that was 2 inches over regulation dimensions. Good man, big laugh, The kind of guy whose handshake tells you everything you need to know about his character. His wife ran a daycare out of their home, and Marlene had been threatening to classify it as a commercial operation in violation of the residential zoning covenant, a threat that, if carried out, would have gutted their income. There was Connie Rausch, 62, retired postal worker, sharp as a tack, who had kept every piece of HOA correspondence she'd ever received in a binder, organized by year. She handed it to me one afternoon over sweet tea on her porch. "I've been waiting for someone to actually do something with all this," she said. "I figured it'd be you when I saw you sitting in the front row at those meetings." There was Walt Schumacher, 58, a former county roads supervisor who had been quietly furious since Marlene's board denied his request to add a storm drain extension to the east entrance, an extension that would have reduced flooding during heavy rain. The board had denied it because the contractor Walt recommended wasn't on the HOA's approved vendor list. The approved vendor list, Walt pointed out to me, had not been updated in 4 years and consisted of 6 companies, 2 of which had gone out of business. The 4 of us started meeting on Sunday evenings at Braddock's garage, which smelled wonderfully of motor oil and wood shavings, and we built a map, literally, a whiteboard map of every grievance, every violation, every suspicious expenditure, every regulatory maneuver Marlene had made over 6 years. It took 3 sessions just to get everything on the board. By early January, what we had was a picture, and the picture was not pretty. Marlene had been steering HOA contracts to preferred vendors for years, not always her nephew's company, but companies with relationships. A landscaping firm owned by a friend from her church, a pool maintenance company whose owner had given the HOA board a Christmas courtesy gift of $500 restaurant gift cards 3 years running. Not illegal on its face, maybe, but ethically rancid and potentially a breach of her fiduciary duty as board president. And then there was the gate again. The gate budget had been $14,000, but the community records showed the actual invoice total was $11,800. The difference, $2,200, had been coded to a line item labeled Community Improvement Administrative Overhead. There was no supporting documentation. In any functioning accounting system, that's a red flag. We drafted a formal complaint to the Georgia Secretary of State's Corporations Division and the Community Association Institute's Ethics Board. Vivian reviewed it. We were careful, specific, and thoroughly documented. We submitted it in late January. Marlene received notice of the complaint in February. I know because she changed at the next board meeting. The casual contempt was replaced by something harder and more defensive. She came in with her attorney, Greer, the nervous folder man, sitting beside her. She cut off public comment early. She moved through the agenda like someone trying to outrun something. She also, around this time, began a whisper campaign. I heard it from Connie first, then from 2 other neighbors. The story going around was that I was a troublemaker with a personal grudge, that I had a history of conflicts with authority, and that my Army background was, and I want to quote this precisely because it's so perfectly petty, a red flag about instability. I will tell you what I told Braddock when he brought this to me, standing in the garage under the fluorescent lights with the smell of motor oil around us. That's fine. Let her talk. Scared people make noise. Danger people make plans. And we had a plan. But then August arrived, and before any of our careful, methodical, legal groundwork could come to fruition, nature stepped in with a Category 3 hurricane named Dolores and compressed our entire timeline into 48 hours. The bus incident didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because everything before it had been building pressure, and a hurricane was about to be the needle. The night before evacuation orders were issued, while I was loading our emergency kit and Renata was packing Lily's backpack for what we hoped would be a 2-night stay at her mother's house inland, I got a call from Walt Schumacher. "Dex," he said, "I need you to look at something." Walt had been doing what Walt does, methodically reviewing county records, and he had found something in the HOA's original community plat, the founding document recorded in 2001 when Pelican Cove Estates was first developed. Buried in Section 14 of the Founding Declaration, which Marlene had apparently never read carefully, or had assumed no one else ever would, was a clause. Specifically, a public safety cooperation clause, required by the county as a condition of the development permit in 2001, when the county approved construction on land adjacent to an evacuation corridor. The clause read, in full, In the event of a declared county, state, or federal emergency, the community association shall not obstruct, restrict, or inhibit the use of any common areas, entry points, or shared access routes by emergency services, government agencies, or designated public safety personnel, under penalty of immediate forfeiture of the association's right to govern said access points for a period of no less than one year. I read it 4 times. "Walt," I said slowly, "does Marlene know this is in here?" "She's been president for 6 years," he said. "She reviewed the governing documents. She had to have seen it. And she put up a gate on an emergency evacuation corridor anyway." Silence. "She put up a gate on an emergency evacuation corridor anyway," Walt confirmed. And here was the thing. Hurricane Dolores was now 14 hours out. Governor's office had issued a mandatory evacuation for our county at 6 a.m., which meant by the time the sun came up, we were in a declared state of emergency. Which meant Marlene's gate, her $14,000 bylaw violating, conflict of interest gate, was now in direct violation of the community's own founding declaration. And the penalty wasn't a fine. The penalty was forfeiture of her authority to control that entrance. Takeaway. HOA founding declarations recorded with county governments are legally binding contracts, and any clause inserted at the government's request, like a public safety cooperation clause, typically has the force of a covenant running with the land, meaning it survives board decisions, bylaw changes, and presidential reigns. I called Vivian. It was 11 p.m. She answered. I read her the clause. There was a pause on her end, the kind of pause that lawyers take when they are processing something that is exactly as good as it sounds. "Dex," she said finally, "that clause doesn't just give you an argument. In a declared emergency, that clause gives you grounds to request direct government intervention to remove the HOA's access control. You could go to the county emergency management office. You could go to the sheriff. If the buses are blocked during an active evacuation order, you're not fighting an HOA dispute anymore. You're reporting an obstruction of emergency operations." And the forfeiture? If she blocks access tomorrow, she hands you the entire east entrance, for a year, by her own founding document. I hung up, stood in my kitchen, and looked out the window at the sky to the south, which was already beginning to take on that green-gray color that coastal people know and dread. The air smelled like salt and rain, and the electric sharpness of something about to break. I called Walt back. "Get Braddock and Connie," I said, "and charge your phones. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." We worked through the night in Braddock's garage, which by 1 a.m. had been transformed into what Connie generously called a situation room, and what I would more honestly describe as 4 exhausted middle-aged people with laptops, a whiteboard, and a pot of coffee strong enough to resurface a road. Here's what we built. Layer 1, the legal architecture. Vivian had agreed to be available by phone starting at 6 a.m. Our primary legal instrument was the Public Safety Cooperation Clause, but we needed to be ready to invoke it formally, not just wave it at someone. Vivian drafted a 1-page cease and desist letter addressed to Marlene Duckett as HOA president, citing the clause, the declared emergency, and the exact penalty provision. The letter was time-stamped and ready to serve by 8 a.m. if buses were blocked. We also prepared a formal complaint to the County Emergency Management Agency, not a phone call, a written complaint, citing Section 14 and requesting that the agency exercise its authority under Georgia Emergency Management Act to designate the east entrance as a public safety access corridor. Walt, with his county background, knew the right office and the right person. Deputy Director Faye Holbrook, who had worked Georgia storm response for 18 years, and did not, Walt assured us, have patience for obstructions. Takeaway. During a declared state of emergency, the Georgia Emergency Management Act, OCGA Section 38-3-1, et sec., grants county emergency management agencies authority to compel access to privately controlled property when it impedes emergency operations. This overrides HOA authority entirely. Layer 2, the documentation net. Braddock had a GoPro he used for job site documentation. We mounted it on a magnetic base that could stick to any vehicle. Walt had a dash cam. I had my phone set up to record continuously using the extended video function. Connie, and this is why I love Connie, had already texted 3 neighbors, asking them to document anything they witnessed at the east entrance with their own phones, starting at 7 a.m. Whatever happened tomorrow, it would be filmed from at least 5 angles. Layer 3. The media thread. I had been in contact, quietly, with a reporter at the Coastal Georgia Ledger named Price Dunbar, who had been following the HOA story in a general way since I'd given him a heads up about the conflict of interest complaint in February. I texted Price at midnight. "If buses get blocked during Evac tomorrow, I'll call you first." He texted back in 40 seconds. "I'll have my camera ready." Layer 4. The National Guard connection. This one was mine alone, and it came from a very specific part of my past. During my Army Corps work, I had spent 18 months coordinating with the Georgia Army National Guard on infrastructure assessment after Hurricane Michael in 2018. My counterpart then was a man named Major Gerald Oates, now Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Oates, stationed at Fort Stewart, who was currently, as I knew from his LinkedIn update 2 months ago, serving as operations coordinator for the Guard's storm response mobilization. I called Gerald at 2 a.m. He picked up on the 3rd ring, which tells you everything about what the Guard's schedule looks like before a Category 3. "Dex, you're in Pelican Cove?" "I am, and I have an HOA president who has blocked bus access to an elementary school on a shared evacuation corridor, and I have the founding document that says she can't do that during an emergency. I need to know, if the county emergency management makes a formal access request, can the Guard be part of the response team?" Gerald was quiet for a moment. "If county emergency management is formally requesting support for an obstruction on a designated evacuation route, yes. We're already mobilized. It doesn't take much to redirect 2 soldiers and a staff car. Just the visual would do it," I said. "Oh, I know," Gerald said. There was something in his voice that sounded like professional satisfaction. "I've seen HOA people fold at a uniform. Get me the formal request from the county, and I'll have someone there." I hung up and stood in the garage for a moment. Outside, the first wind gusts from Dolores's outer bands were starting to move through the neighborhood. The pine trees at the end of Braddock's driveway were beginning to sway, that slow, ominous sweep, like the landscape clearing its throat before it shouts. "You think she'll actually block the buses?" Braddock asked. I thought about Marlene's chain on the door, her laminated badge, the way she'd smiled at my folder full of facts and said, "Moving on." "Yeah," I said, "I do." "Then we're ready." Connie poured the last of the coffee. It tasted like burnt ambition, and I meant that as a compliment. We waited for morning, 6:14 a.m. First light the color of pewter and old brews. The county's mandatory evacuation was on every radio station. My phone had received 3 emergency alerts. Renata and Lily had left an hour earlier, headed inland to her mother's house, Lily clutching her backpack and sergeant's leash, asking me to promise I'd be careful. I promised. I meant it. But there was something I had to finish first. At 6:20, the Coastal Pines Elementary evacuation buses, 4 of them, contracted through the county school district as part of the county's emergency operations plan, pulled up to the east entrance of Pelican Cove Estates. The gate was down, and Marlene Duckett was standing on the other side of it. I want to be precise about this because it matters. She was not there by accident. She was in her HOA vest, the one with the embroidered president's seal. She had her clipboard. She had her golf cart parked sideways behind the gate, as if the vehicle itself was an additional obstacle. And she had, I want to say this slowly so it lands correctly, she had a folding table with a sign. The sign, printed in the same font as HOA violation notices, read, "No unauthorized commercial vehicles. HOA Regulation 7, Section 12. The bus driver, it wasn't Earl this morning, it was a woman named Dottie Banks, maybe 40, with the kind of no-nonsense expression that comes from driving a vehicle full of children through 20 years of Georgia weather, pulled to a stop and opened her door. "Ma'am, I'm here for the school evacuation. I need access to—" "This entrance is closed to commercial vehicles," Marlene said. "You'll need to use the county road stop. There's a Category 3 bearing down. The county road stop doesn't have shelter or supervision for these kids. That's not an HOA concern." Dottie Banks looked at Marlene with the expression of someone who has aged entirely past tolerance for nonsense. Then she looked over at me, because I was standing 20 yards back on the community side of the gate, having walked from my house at 5:55 a.m., precisely so I'd be inside when this moment came. I held up my phone. Recording. I also held up a printed copy of Vivian's cease and desist letter, which I had already handed to Marlene personally at 6:05. Signed receipt required, which she had refused, which meant Braddock had witnessed and documented the refusal on his GoPro. "Marlene," I said, "you've been served with a cease and desist, citing Section 14 of your founding declaration. This is a declared emergency. You are currently in violation of your own governing documents. I've already filed a formal complaint with the County Emergency Management Office." "Your letter is not a court order," she said, and I watched her face as she said it, because she had said the exact same words to me at that first board meeting, 18 months ago, and she thought it was still her best move. "You're right," I said. "It's not. But this is." I had already called Faye Holbrook at County Emergency Management at 6 a.m., the second the evacuation order was confirmed. Faye had made 2 phone calls. The first was to the County Sheriff's Department, requesting a deputy be dispatched to the east entrance of Pelican Cove for an access obstruction during active evacuation. The second was to Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Oates. At 6:28 a.m., a sheriff's cruiser pulled up behind the buses. At 6:31 a.m., a guard staff car pulled up behind the cruiser. Marlene watched them arrive. I watched Marlene. I watched the exact moment when the math completed for her, when she understood that the clipboard, the folding table, and the regulation sign were not, in fact, sufficient armor against a declared emergency, a founding document clause, a county deputy, and 2 National Guard soldiers. Her attorney Greer was not there. It was 6:31 in the morning during a hurricane evacuation. Nobody's attorney is there. The deputy, young guy, maybe 28, with the efficient economy of movement that comes from good training, walked to the gate. He did not yell. He did not draw anything. He simply said, in a calm and reasonable voice, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to open this gate. This entrance has been designated an emergency access corridor. Any further obstruction constitutes interference with emergency operations under Georgia law, which is a criminal misdemeanor." Marlene opened her mouth, closed it, looked at her clipboard, at the folding table, at the sign, and then at the 4 school buses, the sheriff's cruiser, the guard staff car, and me, standing on the community side of her gate, watching. She opened the gate. It took her 11 seconds. The buses went through. Dottie Banks gave me a nod as her bus rolled past. Not a big gesture, just the kind of acknowledgement that passes between people who understand what just happened without needing to perform it. 43 kids got out of the storm. That was the thing. Everything else was secondary to that, and I kept reminding myself of it because what was about to happen next had nothing to do with Lily's safety or those kids' safety. It had to do with accountability, and those are different battles. After the buses cleared, Marlene gathered herself. She called Greer. She retreated to the clubhouse. She sent an emergency message to the HOA email list, which I received because I was a member, saying that the board had been subjected to a coercive government overstep, and that she was consulting legal counsel regarding appropriate responses. She also, in what I can only describe as the petty power equivalent of a Hail Mary, attempted to have my community gate access revoked within 48 hours, claiming I had facilitated an unauthorized entry by being present at the gate. This was the kind of maneuver that sounds plausible to someone who has been getting away with things for 6 years, and sounds insane to anyone with a functional understanding of law. Vivian called me at noon from her own evacuation shelter. "She's trying to revoke your gate access." Can she? Not without a board vote, proper notice, and a hearing, all of which are required under your own bylaws. Also, she'd have to articulate what rule you broke. Being present on community property during an emergency is not a violation of anything. A pause. She's panicking. Good. Dex, this is the moment. The hurricane's going to pass in 36 hours. When people come back, they're going to come back to a community where the HOA president used reserve funds to install a gate that blocked a school evacuation, violated the founding declaration, and tried to obstruct a sheriff's deputy. You need to call a special meeting. Under Georgia Property Owners Association law, a special meeting can be called by any group of members representing at least 10% of the community. Pelican Cove had 187 homes. I needed 19 signatures. I had 31 signed petitions before the storm even made landfall, because Connie had been walking the neighborhood since 7 a.m. with her binder and her purpose. While Dolores moved through, we tracked it from various inland locations, watching the radar bands on phones, the wind rattling everything outside Renata's mother's guest bedroom. I was on the phone with Walt, Braddock, Connie, and Vivienne. We were building the case for the special meeting, and the case was now very, very strong. The financial irregularities, the conflict of interest with Duckett & Sons, the reserve fund minimum violation, the unapproved vendor list manipulation, the gate installation that violated Section 14, and now the active obstruction of an evacuation during a declared emergency, witnessed by a county deputy, 2 National Guard soldiers, 4 school bus drivers, and recorded on no fewer than 6 separate devices. Marlene, in her panic, also made one more mistake. She called Price Dunbar at the Coastal Georgia Ledger to offer her side of the story about the gate incident, apparently expecting that a local reporter would treat an HOA president's press release as news. Price called me immediately after. She called me, he said, and I could hear him almost laughing. She wanted me to write about government overreach targeting a homeowner community. I told her I'd love to hear her side, but I already had 6 videos of the incident and a copy of the founding declaration clause. What did she say? She said she'd get back to me through her attorney. A beat. Dex, I want to run this story, big. Not just the evacuation, the whole 18 months, the gate, the contracts, the vendor list. Can I interview you and your team when people are back in their homes? Yes, I said. Yes, you can. The storm passed in 38 hours. It was bad. Widespread flooding in low-lying areas, 24 downed trees in Pelican Cove alone, fences blown out and shingles scattered like confetti on a cold street. The kind of mess that requires community to rebuild, the kind of moment that clarifies what a neighborhood actually is versus what it performs itself to be. When I drove back into Pelican Cove on a bright Thursday morning, the air smelled like torn pine and wet earth and salt, and everything felt scoured clean. Walt was already out with a chainsaw. Braddock was pulling debris from a neighbor's driveway. Connie was on her porch with her binder, updating it. I stopped at the east entrance. The gate was still there. Not for long. The special meeting was held 12 days after the storm, on a Tuesday evening in the clubhouse that had been cleared of post-hurricane debris and smelled, for once, not of carpet cleaner, but of fresh paint and sawdust from recent repairs. We had requested the meeting on the Monday after residents returned, and per the bylaws, the board had to convene within 14 days of a valid petition. The room held 187 households. That evening, 134 of them sent someone. Marlene arrived in her blazer, with Greer beside her and Theo Haynes one step behind. Peg Whitfield, and I noticed this because I notice everything, sat not with the board table, but in the audience. 3rd row, arms crossed. Done. I sat in the front row with Vivienne on my left, Braddock on my right, and Walt and Connie directly behind me. Walt had the whiteboard materials. Vivienne had the legal filings. I had the folder I'd been building for 18 months, now 4 inches thick, organized by category and date, the way you'd organize a prosecution. Marlene called the meeting to order and immediately attempted to set an agenda that did not include the items we had petitioned for. Vivienne was on her feet before Marlene finished her sentence. Point of order. This special meeting was called pursuant to a member petition under Article 11, Section 3 of the governing bylaws. The agenda is defined by the petition, not by the board. The petitioned items are financial audit findings, the Section 14 violation, and a vote on board leadership. Those items constitute the agenda. She sat down. Greer leaned over to Marlene and whispered. Marlene's jaw tightened. She nodded. Fine, she said. We'll address the petition items. What followed was 62 minutes of the most thorough public accounting I have ever witnessed in a civilian context. Walt presented the financial analysis, the reserve fund violation, the Duckett & Sons invoices, the undocumented $2,200 administrative overhead, the vendor list irregularities, on a projector screen so the entire room could see it. He was calm, methodical, and exhaustively sourced. Every number had a document behind it. When he got to the Duckett & Sons connection, the gate vendor being Marlene's nephew, a sound went through the room. Not a shout, a low, collective exhale, the kind that means, so that's what that was. Then Vivienne walked through the Section 14 clause. She put it on the screen. She read it aloud. She explained what a declared emergency triggered under the clause. She explained what Marlene had done the morning of the evacuation. The folding table, the regulation sign, the gate. And she explained, in plain words, that this constituted a breach of the founding declaration in a way that carried a specific, written penalty. The penalty, Vivian said, is forfeiture of the association's right to govern the east entrance for no less than 1 year. That is not my interpretation. That is the text of the clause recorded in 2001 with the Chatham County Probate Court. It is enforceable as a covenant running with the land. Another sound from the room, louder this time. Marlene stood up. This is a selective and politically motivated reading of "Sit down, Marlene." The voice came from the audience. Roy Halstead, 70 years old, one of the original homeowners in Pelican Cove. A man who had never spoken a harsh word at a board meeting in 15 years. He said it the way you say something when you're finally, simply done. Just sit down. She sat down. We called the vote. Georgia property law permits removal of HOA board officers by majority vote at a special meeting when financial misconduct or breach of fiduciary duty has been documented. We had documented both. The vote was held by paper ballot, counted by 3 volunteers who were not part of either faction, in full view of the room, 101 to 33. Marlene Duckett was removed as HOA president. In the same vote, because we were efficient, the board was expanded from 3 seats to 5, with 2 immediate vacancies filled by interim members, Connie Rausch and Walt Schumacher, both elected by acclamation. Marlene stood, picked up her blazer from the back of the chair, and walked toward the exit without speaking. At the door, she paused. For a moment, I thought she was going to say something. She looked at the room, at 134 neighbors, and then she walked out. The door closed. For a moment, the room was very quiet, and then Braddock Finley, seated to my right, started to slow clap. Just once, twice, 3 times. And then someone in the 3rd row joined, and then the back of the room. And then it wasn't slow clapping anymore. I didn't stand up and take a bow. I just sat there in the front row with my folder on my lap and let it wash over me like clean air after a storm. 6 months later, Pelican Cove Estates looks like a different community. Not physically. The houses are the same. The pine trees are back to their full lazy sway. The sound of a school bus in the morning is once again completely unremarkable. But the atmosphere is different in the way a room is different when you open a window that's been painted shut for years. The new board, Connie as president, Walt as treasurer, Braddock as infrastructure lead, plus 2 new members elected from the broader community, started with a forensic audit of the past 6 years of HOA finances, conducted by an independent CPA firm. The audit found $34,000 in questionable expenditures. The board referred the findings to the Chatham County District Attorney's Office, which opened a preliminary inquiry. No charges have been filed as of this recording, but the inquiry is ongoing. The $14,000 gate, the one that blocked the school buses, was removed. The east entrance is now open, consistent with the Section 14 clause. The school buses run every morning. I sometimes watch from my porch with coffee, while Sergeant leans against my leg. And the sound of that bus pulling in is, I will freely admit, one of the better sounds I have heard in recent years. Greer, the HOA attorney, resigned his representation immediately after the special meeting. He has not been replaced yet. The board is taking applications for new HOA counsel, and Vivian has agreed to review the finalist candidates to ensure they actually know what the governing documents say. As for Marlene, she retained an attorney and threatened to sue the HOA for wrongful removal. Vivian sent a 3-page response outlining the legal basis for the vote and noting that any lawsuit would necessarily require public disclosure of the audit findings in discovery. The lawsuit threat has not been mentioned since. She still lives in Pelican Cove. I see her occasionally at the grocery store. We do not speak, but I have noticed that she no longer wears the HOA vest. This strikes me as appropriate. Here's what the new board did that I'm most proud of, and this is the part I want you to stay for. Walt's storm drain extension, the one that Marlene had blocked for 2 years by refusing to update the approved vendor list, was completed in October using a properly tendered contract process. During the post-Dolores cleanup, The old drainage arrangement had flooded 4 homes in the community's lowest-lying section. With the new extension, the board engineers project a 70% reduction in flood impact for those homes in future storm events. And Connie, being Connie, proposed something at the November board meeting that passed unanimously. The Coastal Pines Community Scholarship Fund, seeded by $5,000 from HOA administrative savings in the first year of the new board's operation. Every year, the fund will award 2 $500 scholarships to graduating seniors from Coastal Pines Elementary's feeder middle and high school, one for academic achievement and one for community service. The first scholarship recipients will be announced at the community's inaugural Pelican Cove block party, scheduled for this coming spring. Dottie Banks, the bus driver, has already confirmed she'll be there. Lily drew a picture of the whole thing, the buses, the gate, the guard soldiers, in crayon, for a school art project on community. Her teacher gave her an A. I have it on the refrigerator, between a grocery list and a pizza magnet, which is exactly where it belongs.
43 kids made it out that morning. That's the number I keep coming back to. Not the boat, not the gate coming down. Not Marlene walking out that clubhouse without her bed. 43 kids. Because here's what I learned in 18 months of fighting this patient isn't weakness. Knowing your rights isn't optional. And the people who abuse more power, they're counting on you not knowing either of those things. Dex didn't win because he was louder. He won because he was ready. He read the documents she assumed nobody would ever read. He found the cloth she thought was buried forever, and when the moment came, he was already standing in the right place. That's not luck, that's homework. If you got a Marlin in your life, someone using rules as a weapon, hiding behind the bed, betting you just get tired and go away. Don't get tired, get informed. Your HOA's founding documents are public report. Pull them. Read section 14, read all of it, because somewhere in that paperwork is the things they don't want you to find. If this story hit close to home, drop it in the comments. And if you think someone else needs to hear it, share it. They know exactly why you said it.